Hello, I'm Suzette Field of A Curious Invitation. Welcome to the 32 Londoners podcast series. Along with Stephen Coates of Antique Beat, on May the 1st, I curated an extraordinary event on the EDF Energy London Eye. For one rotation, each of the Eye's 32 capsules was occupied by a speaker giving a talk about one of 32 significant born Londoners to a small audience. Here is Ian Kelly on the dandy Beau Brummell.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and indeed for choosing Beau Brummell and me of 3132 Alternatives. My name is Ian Kelly. I'm a writer and actor. I specialise mainly in 18th century urban history, in particular the history of London and Paris. And about 8 years ago, I brought out a book about Beau Brummell. I should say it's a very happy escape this evening from my current life, which is writing a biography of and with Dame Vivienne Westwood. So I've escaped from the beautifully upholstered bosom of Dame Vivienne for a few hours. But strange to relate, it was 18th century fashion and the history of London that, as it were, brought us together. But I should explain maybe a few things about Brummell, about dandyism, because some of you may know a great deal already. I know there are fashion students here, and some of you may be as deeply bemused as the man was who opened the door for us of who the heck Beau Brummell was. Beau Brummell was definitively the most famous man in early 19th century London, in Regency, London. And his singular kind of claim to fame I'll move on to during the course of our little talk today, but it's a importantly London story. I thought I had found that perfect person-shaped keyhole on a period and on a city for which I hold particular fascination. There's nothing really quite like London of the mid to late 18th century. And as we spin up in view of it, I should maybe point out a few of the underlying currents, I suppose, to what's going on and why this story maybe is important. It's estimated that the population of London quadrupled during the period between 1750 and 1800. By 1800, there's a population of about 1 million, and it's almost the biggest city in the world, although possibly Constantinople, Istanbul is bigger. But the really fascinating thing is the economic explosion of London in the late 18th century, because nothing had ever been seen quite like it. By 1800, this city is the richest city in the world, and the second richest city of that period is Paris, with, it is estimated, less than half the wealth of London. There is nothing quite like London of this period. It is to the European economy a little what Moscow is to the modern Russian economy. This extraordinary powerhouse, and as a result of this, these amazing new narratives of self-invention and kind of new money. And this story, obviously, to some extent, is about clothes and new money. I say obviously, as if you'd know. It said Beau Brummell dandy this evening. It's a wonderful word, dandy. Scintillates in all sorts of fascinating ways through the ages. There's a plaque on Beau Brummell's house. It exists to this day. It's just over in that direction, number 4 Chesterfield Street. It's got a plaque on it, and it was put up in the 1950s. And they were going to say Beau Brummell dandy, but the argument in the GLC building just down here at the time was that actually dandy was not the sort of thing that one should put up in public in London in the 1950s. It says Beau Brummell, leader of fashion, as a sort of a euphemism instead. I was at a literary event about a more recent book of mine just the other day in Shropshire. Somebody came up to me with a copy of Beau Brummell, The Ultimate Dandy. It was subtitled in the UK. My American publishers very badly wanted to subtitle it Beau Brummell, The Ultimate Metrosexual. I fought long and hard and eventually won. But anyway, this woman came up and she said she wanted this for her son, and I was just making conversation. I said to her, so your son then? Your son, is he a bit of a dandy? And this woman of a certain age looked at me somewhat askance, and she said, She said, "Oh, Mr. Kelly," she said, "I do hope not. He does have a girlfriend." Well, I mention all of this in case there's any confusion, as it were, because dandy has shifted in meaning over the centuries, and indeed shifted within Beau Brummell's own lifetime. But the important point I'm trying to make is simply this. Beau Brummell, when he was described as a dandy, took it as a singular compliment to his masculinity and, for what it's worth, to his heterosexuality. His idea of dandyism was an idea of less is more, an idea of minimalism. Beau Brummell once said that if people turn to look at you in the street, you are not well dressed, but either too stiff, too tight, or too fashionable. And he is right at the center of a rather fascinating moment in fashion history and a fascinating moment in the history of this extraordinary city. In biography, we talk about the life and the argument for the life, and there's an amazingly dramatic life. I wish I had time to adumbrate for you this evening, but I won't too terribly much. But there's also an argument, which in brief is sort of this. This city, extraordinary to relate now, once ruled an empire. There's a theory current, cultural historians of far higher standing than myself, people like Stephen Parisian or Aileen Ribeiro I could mention, who posit that just maybe the one thing that the British Empire, so-called, might be remembered for, the one cultural export in any event of this city that went global, is the suit. It is a style of dress that is alluded to across the Western world to this day by newsreaders and politicians and people on red carpets and what have you. It is definitively a style of dress that has its origins in this city. It has its origins at this moment in time, the very late 18th, early 19th centuries. It has its origins around a coterie of rather privileged men who lived just the other side of that park there, who were known as the dandiacal body, or the dandy body, and around a personality cult of a man called Beau Brummell. And at its simplest, it's kind of that which allows me to beg your time in the London Eye this evening for a singularly important Londoner. There is no Brit who has had greater impact on global fashion than Beau Brummell, and arguably there is no single person in the history of fashion who changed things quite as much as Beau Brummell did. He's right at the center of what's known as the Great Male Renunciation in fashion history terms, that moment when men forgo forever silk and swathing and feathers and makeup and wigs and frou-frou and what have you, and adopt a sort of a uniform. And it was Beau. But it is also, I should say, an extraordinarily dramatic story and a story of this city. So I should point out some of the sites that are maybe more Beau Brummell relevant. The joy of being an historian of this period now is you can be rather more honest about London as it was then. It's now become something of an axiom to point out that the age of elegance, so-called, the age of Jane Austen or Zoffany or Reynolds or whatever, is also an age of Hogarth, he's speaking in the pod above us, an age of a kind of a scabrous and irreverent press, and an age of a kind of an alternative London, a sexual economy, which is one of the things that I know Dan Cruikshank is talking about this evening. And Beau Brummell rather fascinatingly straddles these two worlds. He's born, I should take you to the beginnings of it all, just behind us. I'll tell you where in just a second. But one of the joys of the research of this period is that now you keep on coming across these new ways of looking at the 18th century. And my research in St Margaret's, Westminster, which is the little church just between Big Ben and Westminster Abbey, where the parish records of this parish are still kept, is this. Beau Brummell was born in a little house just behind us that was then known as a number 5 Downing Square, a little backwater of Whitehall. It is now known as number 10 Downing Street. He was born in the servants' attic, which indeed I could even just about point out to you if we had a tiny bit more light, but you can see it from here. We are poised above his very birth site. It is absolutely perfect, absolutely typical of this kind of deliberate obfuscation by the Victorians of what had gone on during the Regency. Beau Brummell was born in a servant's attic in Downing Street. His parents weren't even married to each other. They were living in the highest echelons of sort of Georgian high society, great friends with Richard Brinsley Sheridan, Charles James Fox. They were living over there in Downing Square and not married to each other. His mother, it turns out, was a courtesan, a professional sex worker. There is an extraordinary kind of sea change in the acceptable morality of this city from the late 18th into the mid-19th century, and Beau Brummell's story also rather wonderfully hinges around that, and helps to explain a little bit of that as well. That was the ghost of Beau Brummell's mother, as I took her reputation in vain. They were working there in Downing Street for Lord North, our least successful Prime Minister, lost the American colonies, amongst other claims to ill repute, also widely described as the ugliest man in London. There's a rather wonderful anecdote I will share with you. It was said that his personal unattractiveness was only surpassed by that of his immediate family in Downing Street. He had a wife and a number of daughters. And there's a wonderful anecdote that comes down to us via Queen Victoria, which was told over there in Buckingham Palace. If it's lit, yes, there it is. An event in Downing Street, and a politician turning to Lord North and saying, Lord North, Prime Minister, who's that monster in the corner? And the Prime Minister said, that monster, sir, that monster is my wife. And this politician, trying to dig himself out, said, well, no, I didn't mean her, sir, I meant that gorgon next to her. And he said, that gorgon, sir, that gorgon is my daughter. But rather wonderfully, this comes down to us via Queen Victoria, who used to enjoy, keeping a diary, and was told this story by Earl Goderich, who was one of her early Prime Ministers, at a reception there in Buckingham Palace behind us, until the guest on her other side turned around and said, yes, I do know, I am Lord North's daughter. She'd married and changed her name by then. Anyway, I digress. Except to say, one of the absolute joys of Georgian and Regency England is its kind of volubility and its wit. And possibly the first thing I should say about Beau Brummell is, long before he was famous for being supposedly the handsomest man in London, as in Beau, for being the best dressed man in London, of which more in a second or two, he was also supposedly the funniest man in London, when an ability to speak was the most prized issue in this amazing city of kind of self-invention. And you can see that in the plays of the era and the novels of Jane Austen, Fanny Burney, that ability to speak in inordinately long and complex sentences, endlessly subclaused, ideally ending in a quip. There is no more prized skill. And Beau Brummell was supposedly very good at it. Sadly, not much of this tumbles down to us as modern wit, although I'll share a few with you, and you may or may not think them funny. He was past the vegetables, once the peas, and he said, I never eat vegetables. He said, I may once have eaten a pea. I have no intention of repeating the experiment. There's a better one, actually, from Carlton House, which is the palace sadly gone from the side of the Mall there. It's kind of to the right of Buckingham Palace. And all that actually you can see of Carlton House now, because it was demolished, it was a grand Regency palace built by the Prince Regent, and Beau Brummell knew it particularly well. And all that remains of it, if I can negotiate myself, where are the floodlights on? Where's Trafalgar Square? Can anybody see? It must be round about there. It must be up there. Well, the National Gallery on the north side of Trafalgar Square, the pillars there are all that remains of Carlton House Palace. Anyway, there was a party there, and Beau Brummell and the Prince Regent had some sort of spat, some sort of argument, and the Prince Regent threw a glass of wine in Beau Brummell's face. Beau Brummell was sitting on his right, red wine. And Beau Brummell picked up his glass, threw it into the face of the person sitting on his right, and said, "The Prince's toast, pass it round." And this is widely recorded in the gossip columns of this wondrous city. Well, it's partly a story of social ascendancy, because the Brummells, who've been working as private secretary and living in the attic of Downing Street, rose to be one of the richest couples in Georgian London, eventually owning grand estates, grace and favour apartments in Hampton Court, out that way, also an estate in Newbury in Berkshire. You can still visit, actually, Donington Grove, if any of you are touring England, as it were. It's a very beautiful country house hotel now, and there's a hermitage there that was built by the Beau Brummell family, and the Brummells advertised in a London newspaper for a hermit for their hermitage. This led later to a little exchange you may know in a Tom Stoppard play called Arcadia, a character in that who similarly is re-landscaping her gardens in the Capability Brown style, and says, yes, but surely a hermit who reads a daily newspaper is not a hermit in whom one can have absolute confidence. I mention all of this because it still exists to this day, the Flint Hermitage, and it's all a true story. And it's where Beau Brummell, as a teenager, heard of the French Revolution from no less a person than Charles James Fox. And partly the fascinating issue with the clothes is this. There's sort of a sea change in what it is to be a British man of this era. The people around his parents, people like Charles James Fox, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, prided themselves on their ability to cry in the House of Commons, the older one before this was built. Men of sentiment, men of feeling, men who cried. There was a new sang-froid described by the French as such, a new sort of, emotional unavailability of what it was to be a British man. And in brief, one of the arguments for the fascinating issue with clothes is that they are, as it were, the visual corollary of that, a sort of a simplicity, a sort of a distance, a sort of a pared down uniform. But the style spread extraordinarily fast from the very late 1790s into the early 1800s, partly, to begin with, it should be said, up and down the gentlemen's clubs of St James's, over there by the palace, where Beau Brummell was a member of Brooks's and White's, and commented on people's clothes. And it's, for the first time, the imposition of monochrome. Almac's Club, over on King Street over there, was where he insisted that all gentlemen were attired in black and white or midnight blue and white. It's the origins of sort of black tie and white tie and all that malarkey, but much more impressive than that in a sense. It's the beginnings of that imposition of monochrome upon the modern world. And I should say, not just a story of men's fashion. Coco Chanel was a stated disciple of Beau Brummell and introduced a very similar aesthetic into women's clothing and fashion, but a century later. And so, yes?
Was it a backlash because of the Incoy art?
It is a rather fascinating backlash, absolutely. I mean, fashion is partly always a story of pendulums, pendular, whatever, and yes, the incroyable, the merveilleuse, the macaronis in London, this sort of ridiculousness of male fashion needed its counterposition, and on one level, sometimes the Beau Brummell look is described as simply neoclassicism in clothes. And what's fascinating is that unlike Georgian architecture, which is much loved but we've moved on from to some extent, people keep on coming back to the same neoclassicism. This suit, I always feel I should try and wear when I'm speaking about Beau Brummell, was made for me by Meyer and Mortimer's, the tailors that exist still on Sackville Street. Jonathan Meyer was Beau Brummell's tailor. Unexpected perk of being a historical biographer. But I mention this because there is an extraordinary longevity to what goes on. On one level, and if you take away no other footnote to all of this, I should say, trousers, full-length trousers for men. It is Beau Brummell, it is this city, and it is him. Before this, urban menswear for men, for grown men, is breeches and stockings or breeches and boots. It is he who designs, with Jonathan Meyer or Mayer for the first time, this sort of full-length look, if you will. And wonderfully, lots of this still tumbles down to us. I mean, you can go visit his hatters, Locke's Hatters on St James Street, his wine emporium, Berry Brothers, just next door, where he had himself weighed on a regular basis. Both of them very keen to point out to me that Beau Brummell still owed them money, as if I was likely to pay up. But there is, as it were, this drama of ascendancy and the sheer sort of glamour and fame of that life and this story. But there is also the ongoing story of, as it were, these seeds that were planted by him. Taking off, first of all, it should be said, in St James's, and then in particular at the theatre. It is there that the fashion really spreads, which takes us to that other part of the Beau Brummell story, perhaps, because it spreads variously. There's St James Street and the clubs. There's his levee, it should be said as well. People came to watch him dress. It was said he took 3 hours to dress. An hour of that was naked and him shaving and bathing in hot water every day, which was considered an egregious vanity and somewhat bad for your health. But even the Prince Regent would turn up to watch this. And then the tying of the cravat, which was a singular issue, which would take him many, many, many attempts. Robinson, his valet, used to pass by with all these crumpled attempts, and people who'd gathered there, including the Prince Regent, would say, "What are these?" And he would say, These are Mr. Brummell's failures." That issue of minimalism, taking great attention to detail. parenthetically, maybe I should say, one of the key issues of this minimalism, this strict adherence to black and white, was keeping things white in a city which was covered in a kind of a sea coal smog an awful lot of the time, and the laundry was sent out to Islington, which you can see over in that direction, to get it away from the city to be washed and then brought back in. But you had to change several times a day to keep your shirt white if that was going to be the new, you know, insignia, if you will, of privilege and of taste. These whole new desiderata of what it is to be a gentleman, or what it is to be wealthy and tasteful, to do with your relationship with your tailor and sort of the neoclassical ideals there involved. But the theatre is where it properly took off. You can see some of the back here, you can in daylight in any event, from the Haymarket, and that he knew well, and the Italian opera opposite. And there his world also crosses over again with this kind of sex trade that is the family background, and takes us to an unexpected part of the story, but another perhaps bit of the London story of its era. I went to Caen in Normandy, in Calvados, just to visit his grave. I didn't think I'd find much there because Caen, as many of you know, I'm sure, was nearly entirely destroyed by British and Canadian bombardment after the D-Day landings. But it's where Beau Brummell spent the last decades of his life. He fled London, he fell into penury, and he eventually fell into madness, it should be said. And it's never known quite why one of the richest men in London, and certainly one of the most famous, publicly insulted the Prince of Wales, gambled away all his money, seemingly threw it all away. Well, in the Hôpital du Bon Sauveur, the asylum outside Caen that survives to this day, I found his medical records. They'd never been looked at before. Beau Brummell died there in 1840, having been admitted in 1838, suffering from tertiary syphilis. And the other fascinating business of the Beau Brummell story is it narrates also the shift that happens in this city, and some of that shift as well in British morality and British public morality. And in brief, it goes like this. This confusion over why this wild, licentious, sexually knowing city became this clamped down Victorian new world is hinged on this. In the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, there was a syphilis epidemic in London. It hit particularly harshly the theatrical and artistic and high society part of London, because Regency high society was wildly promiscuous. Beau Brummell suffered from syphilis, which manifests as a kind of a bipolar disorder, it should be said, and goes some way to explaining now what went on with him, but also goes some way to explaining the latter interest in him. Because some of you may be here because of that other fame of Beau Brummell, I don't know. He's a range of aftershaves in Russia. It's sometimes said that, honestly, that Eugene Onegin was based partly on the story of him. He's a range of wallets and leatherware in France. Baudelaire and Balzac both became fascinated with the idea of Beau Brummell and the dandy. And in brief, when Dorian Gray was first published, Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, a generation later, but first of all published in France and in French, it was written of in France and in French as a parable about syphilis, a parable about the destroyed aesthete, a parable about what it is to kind of live too well the extraordinary urban experiences that are maybe open to some and, as it were, suffer the consequences. He was written of or discussed as a sort of a parable, a morality tale, if you will, and therefore the name, certainly in British popular culture, somewhat dismissed. Although there was a range of school blazers, I used to wear one, which is where I first knew the name, that said Beau Brummell. So there you go. In brief, that is some of the extraordinary sort of, it's kind of a Greek arc of a life, really, because he comes from nowhere in particular. He scratches the very top lights of existence, as it might be, of its era, and he ends up poetically and distressingly one of the first people experimented upon in straitjackets, being given high-pressure hydrotherapy, which was the ridiculous ways of treating the insane in the 1840s. And yet, this sort of amazing legacy as well. Certainly Savile Row, the suit, all of that. The idea of the maverick, the eruption of caprice, as is written of by the French in British popular culture, in fashion in particular, that too. There's a statue now, it should be said, on Jermyn Street as the sort of the spirit of sartorial London, and happily and weirdly, it led me to the current project, and Vivienne Westwood. Who'd have thought it? So in brief, there it is, because I was asked to leave a bit of time for question and answers and the view. I'll leave you with one of his little aphorisms. He was a great lover of them, if I can remember it. Beau Brummell once said that when in society, one should stay no longer than it takes to endeavour to make an impression, and then, whether one has made one or not, one should leave. Though sadly I can't, because we're stuck inside a pod. So that is some of the overview of Beau Brummell and him as, it seems to me, one of the great semi-lost stories of London.
Thanks for listening. 32 Londoners was sponsored by Hendrick's Gin, who created 32 unique cocktails, one for each capsule and one for each London borough. To hear more talks and for more information on 32 Londoners, go to 32londoners.com. Or, for more information on Antique Beat and A Curious Invitation and the other events we create, go to www.antiquebeat.co.uk or acuriousinvitation.com.